I woke up in the middle of the night, startled by something I couldn't identify. My heart was racing, though I couldn't recall any nightmare that might have caused it. As I tried to sit up, I realized something was wrong. My body wouldn't respond. I was lying flat on my back, and it felt like every muscle in my body was paralyzed. Only my eyes could move, darting back and forth in the dark room. The moonlight streaming through the blinds barely illuminated the edges of the room, casting strange, elongated shadows along the walls. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was sleep paralysis, something I'd heard about but never experienced before. But the air felt heavy, and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. The silence was oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. As the seconds ticked by, I became increasingly aware of a presence in the room. It was that unmistakable feeling you get when someone's eyes are on you. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of my mind, a byproduct of my fear, but the sensation was too strong to ignore. It was as if something, or someone, was looming nearby, watching me closely, its attention sharp and focused. I strained to hear something, anything, but there was only silence. My eyes scanned the room as much as they could in my frozen state, but nothing seemed out of place. At least, not yet. That's when I saw it. A dark, ominous figure at the foot of my bed. It wasn't there a moment ago, and yet now it loomed there, tall and featureless, like a person made entirely of shadow. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. It stood unnaturally still, blending with the darkness of the room, yet somehow darker, like it absorbed the light around it. My breath caught in my throat, and my body remained frozen in place, completely defenseless. My mind raced for an explanation, but none came. All I could do was stare at this thing, this figure, and wait for it to make its next move. Fear gripped me tighter than the paralysis. I tried to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice wouldn't come. I was trapped in my own body, every limb locked in place as if held down by invisible chains. All I could do was lie there, eyes wide with terror, as the shadow remained motionless. The weight of my helplessness pressed down on me, intensifying the fear already coursing through my veins. I'd never felt this vulnerable in my entire life, completely at the mercy of something I couldn't understand, something that shouldn't exist. The air grew colder as the shadow slowly began to move. It didn't walk or shuffle, but seemed to glide toward me, soundless and deliberate. Inch by inch, it approached the side of the bed, and with each passing second, the sense of dread mounted. I could feel the temperature drop as it neared, my skin prickling with goosebumps. It was as if the shadow carried the chill of the grave with it. My heart pounded even harder, the pulse throbbing painfully in my chest. I was about to come face to face with this thing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The shadow stopped just beside me, towering over my frozen body. It felt so close that I could almost touch it, if I could move, that is. Then I felt it, cold breath on my face, like a winter breeze in the dead of night. It was sharp and unnatural, making my skin crawl. The breath was slow, deliberate, as though the figure was savoring my fear. I could feel my insides trembling, though my body remained rigid and still. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. This was no ordinary nightmare. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. The words were unintelligible at first, just hissing sounds that seemed to echo inside my mind. But soon, they coalesced into something more sinister. "You cannot escape." The voice was low and guttural, sounding like it came from deep within the shadow. The words sent shivers down my spine, as though they were being spoken directly into my soul. Then, without warning, I felt pressure on my chest, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe. It wasn't just the usual tightness of sleep paralysis. This was different. It felt as though the shadow was physically pressing down on me, pinning me to the bed with an invisible force. My lungs strained for air, and my vision began to blur at the edges as panic set in. I could feel my heart racing, each beat louder than the last, as if it might burst from my chest at any moment. It was then that I saw something I hadn't noticed before, two pinpricks of light where the shadow's eyes should have been. They were barely visible, just faint glimmers in the darkness, but they were unmistakable. Those glowing eyes bore into me, filled with malevolence, as though the shadow was feeding off my terror. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and merciless. It didn't have a face, not in the traditional sense, but those eyes were enough to paralyze me with dread. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, desperately trying to wake up, to break free from this nightmare. My mind screamed at my body to move, but nothing happened. I was still trapped, still powerless beneath the shadow's oppressive presence. All I wanted was to wake up, to escape this horror, but my body remained frozen in place. It felt like I was caught between two worlds, one where I was awake but couldn't move, and another where this thing, this shadow, had total control over me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shadow began to retreat, pulling back slowly. The crushing weight on my chest lifted, and I gasped for air, feeling the coldness leave my lungs. The whispering stopped, and the room fell into a deathly quiet. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I was free. My body was still paralyzed, but I could feel the tension easing. But something about the shadow's retreat felt wrong, as though it wasn't leaving but merely waiting for something. My relief was short-lived. The shadow paused at the foot of my bed again, standing completely still as though waiting for me to lower my guard. My heartbeat, which had just begun to slow, picked up again. The sense of dread returned with even greater intensity. I knew, deep down, that the shadow wasn't done with me yet. It was toying with me, letting me believe I had some semblance of control before it would strike again. The shadow didn't wait long before it began moving again, this time much faster than before. It glided toward me, more aggressive, more determined. I could feel the air growing colder once again, the familiar chill settling into my bones. This time, I knew it wouldn't stop until it had taken something from me, something vital. My body remained rigid, as though bound by invisible chains, as the shadow loomed closer and closer, until it was hovering just inches away from my face. The shadow reached out with one of its long, skeletal hands, the dark fingers curling in the air. I could feel the cold emanating from its touch before it even made contact. When it finally brushed against my arm, a numbing cold spread through my entire body, like ice water flooding my veins. The sensation was so intense that I almost felt like I was sinking deeper into the bed, like the shadow was trying to pull me into the darkness with it. My mind screamed in panic, but my body refused to obey. The room grew even darker. The shadows seemed to swallow the last remnants of light. It was as though the entire world outside my bed no longer existed. Just me, the shadow, and the suffocating darkness. I could no longer see the walls of my room, or even the edges of my bed. All that remained was the shadow's piercing eyes and the cold, skeletal hand still gripping my arm. The air felt thicker, almost impossible to breathe, and the fear that coursed through me was so potent that it made my heart race to the point of pain. "Soon," the shadow whispered again, its voice low and guttural. The sound was almost inhuman, like the creaking of ancient wood or the groaning of a dying tree. I could feel its breath on my skin, colder than death itself. The word echoed in my mind, a promise of something more to come. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow began to fade into the darkness, leaving me alone, trembling in my bed. The weight lifted, and I could finally move, but I didn't dare. My body remained locked in place, as if expecting the shadow to return at any moment. I lay there, paralyzed with fear long after the shadow had gone. Even though my body was free from its grip, I didn't dare close my eyes again. The fear was too raw, too real. My mind kept replaying the scene over and over again, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or had I really encountered something far beyond this world? The questions raced through my head, but none of them mattered because the fear still gripped me tightly. Eventually, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the blinds, casting a soft, warm glow across the room. I could hear the distant sounds of birds chirping outside, the world slowly waking up. But inside, I was still trapped in the terror of the night. The shadows were gone, replaced by the comforting light of day, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still there, lurking just beyond the light, waiting for me to close my eyes again. As I finally sat up, every muscle in my body aching from the tension of the night, I heard a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, but there. Soon, it repeated, the same guttural tone that had haunted me hours before. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The shadow wasn't gone. It was still here, waiting, watching. The sunlight felt weaker now, less comforting. I knew that it wasn't over. The shadow's promise echoed in my mind, a dark warning that would stay with me long after this night. For the rest of the day, I went through the motions of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the fear. I knew the shadow would return, that it was only a matter of time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its glowing eyes and felt its cold breath. The world outside seemed brighter, but inside, I was counting the hours until nightfall. I dreaded the return of the darkness, knowing that the shadow was out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. And when it did return, I wouldn't be able to fight it. All I could do was wait and hope that somehow, this time, I'd survive the night.